One of the interesting things that evaluation is far behind many other areas of development in terms of the use of big data. You find in many organizations that the evaluation department is completely separated from the data development center, and which doesn't happen in areas like, for example, emergency programming. They make a big use of big data research, but evaluation, for a number of reasons, has got left behind. There's a lot of suspicion on the part of many evaluators about big data. So I think an interesting way of thinking about this is, I've been asked to do a presentation in a conference next week. Will big data kill evaluation? Quite a dramatic question. But if we think 2 or 3 years from now, we're going to find that most organizations will have one integrated data set. At the moment, there's a monitoring data set, there's a research data set, there's a management data set, there's an evaluation data set. In 2 or 3 years, it's all going to be integrated. And so evaluation is going to be part of a broad information approach. And if evaluators don't get up to speed with understanding about big data, it's going to be data analysts who are going to be defining how organizations address evaluation questions. So it's really critical for have capacity development programs, both for evaluators to understand about big data, but for big data professionals to understand about evaluation. And there's a number of reasons why that doesn't happen. At the moment, the big data people and evaluators speak a completely different language. They have different ways they think about what is data, what is the value of data, how you analyze data, whether you use predictive modeling or whether you use experimental designs. There's very big differences. There's a lot of suspicion on both sides. For example, the biggest crime in evaluation is to do data mining, where you just take a big data set and you run thousands of regressions till you find some significant relationships. That's the basic logic of much of the big data analysis. So what is considered a crime among evaluators is the main methodology for big data. So I think it's going to be really critical that evaluators understand the nature of big data, its great potential, the many threats, and they really get up to speed so that they have a place at the table 2 or 3 years from now as organizations begin to develop these integrated data platforms. So I think that's a message there for evaluators. I think one of the big issues to be thinking about is whether big data will be inclusive or extractive. I'll explain what those two terms mean. Extractive is where the donor agencies, governments say, isn't big data great because we can collect information on poor people without having to waste time going to talk to them. This is fantastic, we save so much money. That's an extractive approach where you use it to isolate poor people from the development process. An inclusive approach is where you understand the great potential of big data. For example, the way UNDP has used this for country planning, where you get tens of thousands of people communicate through internet, through phones, and they give their views on what should be the development priorities in Uganda or whichever country you're in. So there's a really big decision there, and you really need to keep your eyes open, because if you go to many big data conferences, everyone's saying you save so much money using big data. You don't, and they even say interviewing people, you can't trust it because people may be biased. Just use big data, it's really rigorous, it tells the truth. And the implications are you're excluding poor people from development. So that's one of the biggest concerns. I think the other one is just reliance on quantitative data, that you can tell everything by some numbers. You can tell a lot of things, other things you can't tell, or it's much more difficult. So again, I think it's very easy to get blown away. You know, everybody with their smartphones, isn't it incredible? We've got this app and we can measure how tall babies are, what their weight is, whether people are sick, just from our phone. And so you get so excited about what you can do that you don't step back and think about what is it you're not knowing. Just one example there is that a lot of people do interviews by cell phone. So isn't it great we don't have to go to this dangerous area? We sit in our office and interview people. And if you ask the question, if you're doing a face-to-face interview, one of the things you know is somebody else is in the room. You're talking to this young woman, the mother-in-law is sitting on the windowsill watching to make sure that the daughter doesn't say something which is wrong. When you're doing interview by phone, you've no idea whether the person you're talking to is on their own, whether somebody's sitting next to them saying, don't say that. So you just lose these contextual cues, including things like when you're walking to an interview, you already have a feeling, is this a safe part of the city? Are there lots of people out on the streets? Is everybody scared? You already have a feeling of the sort of context before you even get to the house. With your phone, you don't. There you zoom in, and so understanding the tremendous potential of big data, but not being blown away by these sort of fancy things you can do by pressing a button. The danger is that you just reject big data and you say there's some terrible things, so let's not use it, let's just continue using our old methods, and so that's not going to work. So it's really quite a big challenge. The message I just like to give is there are already a lot of very exciting examples where big data is already being used for evaluation. So it's not just some wild, crazy idea. Any kind of evaluation methodology you can think of, big data is already being used. So it's a question of how you refine it, how you build it in more systematically, how you develop a common language. So there's great opportunities. I think we're beginning to know what to do, but there's still evaluation training at the moment doesn't tend to have modules on big data. So there's quite a lot of work to do, but it can be done. But if it's not done 3 years from now, there's a big danger that evaluators will be largely excluded from evaluation. It will be done by data analysts on data which is collected for monitoring purposes, and evaluators will find themselves marginalized. They've still got time to catch up, but they really need to be moving along. One example is the analysis of Twitter. There's incredibly exciting things can be done by the analysis of Twitter feeds. For example, I was looking at a study in Indonesia detecting increasing hostility to women in factories based upon analysis of all of the tweets. So this is one area of identifying potential problems. You can detect poverty by looking at the number of references to hunger, to food in tweets. So that's one area where there's a great deal can be done, particularly for detecting issues, rising ethnic tension, poverty, people are fearing they're going to have to migrate because of drought. So it's a very powerful tool which is already being used quite extensively. So that's sort of one area. Just one other area, satellite images. UNDP is already doing some very interesting things. For example, studies on protected forest areas, of how effective is UNDP in protecting forests from erosion, from logging. And satellite images can give you a longitudinal series of data over time about the forest coverage in different areas. And you can use this to select a sample using things like propensity score matching, where you get a lot of different indicators from the satellites, so you can improve the quality of the sample which you're using for analyzing what is happening on the ground. So those are just two examples. There's many more. Just one final point on that. At the moment, what tends to happen is the clever people in Silicon Valley think, wouldn't it be neat to develop an app which can do a certain kind of thing? And at the moment, most evaluators don't have the skill or the understanding to tell the app developers what it is they want. So somebody gives you a phone and says, why don't you try to use this Twitter analysis or this image analysis? And it may not be what you wanted, but that's what's sort of come on with the phone. And so just being able to go back to the developers and saying, what we really want is, this is great, but it doesn't quite solve the problem. For example, we want to understand how active women are in meetings. Can you develop us a tool that we can video meetings on our phone and then analyze the percentage of of the conversation time, which involves women, using sentiment analysis. So do other people listen when the women are talking, or do you just, the UNDP says we have to bring women into the meeting, so shut up and let the woman talk, and then we'll get on with the meeting. So, telling the app developers, we want this tool which will help us to analyze how active women are in the meeting, what people think about women participating. Go away and do it. And at the moment it's the other way around. Somebody sits in Silicon Valley and thinks, wouldn't it be neat to have an app which can do something or other. So I think some of the encouraging efforts, which have not necessarily been achieved yet, there's more concern about empowerment, of trying to give voice to vulnerable groups, to involve them in decision making, to try to make sure that their needs are being addressed. Similarly, there's more focus on trying to incorporate gender analysis into a lot of development evaluation. So those are some of the areas where I think there is some promising developments, but there's a lot of very discouraging things. One of the most discouraging things is that many evaluations have a very narrow focus on the outcomes which were identified in the results measurement. And so in the area of gender, specifically where I've worked a lot, very often the results framework will just say more women will participate in meetings. So you measure that, but for example, what is the effect on women's empowerment of participating in meetings? Do they have more confidence to negotiate with government, to demand services? Does the relationship to men change? What effect does it have on their income? These things are very often not evaluated because they weren't in the results framework. Sometimes they are, but very often, particularly organizations which have not worked very much on gender, when they say empowering women, they start off thinking how many people go to meetings. And so when evaluators come in and try and broaden the focus, very often the agency will say, no, this is not in the results framework. And you find a lot of project managers will say it's not fair to evaluate us on gender because it wasn't in the results framework. And so the focus on gender, it's improving a little bit, but it's still quite limited. Very little focus on unintended outcomes. A lot of projects which intend to promote women's empowerment do some good things, but one of the very common things is that you get what is called blowback, that when women become more empowered, men feel threatened, and so you can get, for example, women have been given cell phones, the man takes it away. There was a study in Zambia where at the end of the day the man came in, looked at all of the phone numbers that his wife had called up. If a man responded, he beat up his wife. So very often there's a study done how great phones are in empowering women, which they are, but that doesn't look at the unintended outcomes, which can be positive as well, but some are not. So this is a concern of often a fairly narrow focus of the evaluations, where lots of very positive things which are going on you're just not looking at because being tied to a results framework, or project managers are very nervous about being evaluated on things that they weren't committed to do. It's not fair. So you get that kind of pressure. So that's one sort of area of concern. And then just the other is everybody at the beginning of every report they say programs are complex, but very few evaluations actually have a way of addressing complexity. So you still do your evaluation as if the program was simple and linear. So every report at the beginning says this program is complex, but that tends not to be addressed very well in evaluations. And the related issue is emergence, the idea that programs change as they develop, and many evaluations don't. They do a baseline study and then they compare were the original objectives achieved, and so the idea that programs are dynamic, they're constantly changing. 3 years from now, a program may have a completely different focus than it has now, but many evaluations are not very well designed to capture that. And so I think wrestling with how we evaluate programs in a complex world where programs are constantly changing is still a challenge for evaluation. And methodologies exist to look at those, but it's tends not to be very widely applied. There are cases obviously where it is, but there are just many cases where you're still pretending the program is very simple, including most theories of change. Theories of change assume that programs are linear and that pretty static, and you say these are the inputs, these are the processes, these are the outputs, these are the outcomes, as if the program today is the same as it was 3 years ago when it began. So theory of change needs to be rethought to make it more flexible. It's hard to do that, but it needs to be done, I think. A first thing which is cutting edge, but not necessarily because we've got there yet. A great deal of the discussion on the SDGs claims you can't evaluate them. I've been to many meetings where the discussion begins saying, I think we're all agreed it's impossible to evaluate the SDGs. They're so complex, so all we can really do is just focus on monitoring. Have the schools been built? Have the water supply systems been put in? So I think one of the big challenges, the bleeding edge, is how you can adapt evaluation methodologies to complex programs, multi-sectoral programs which are changing, programs which are very broad and ambitious. So I think just on the very basic level, how can you think about evaluating the SDGs? I think it would be incredibly concerning if after 15 years of investing billions of dollars, people said, we really don't know if it had any effect because it was too complicated to measure, but look how many schools have been built. So I think that's a challenge for evaluation methodology, but the relationship between evaluators and management, and just trying to get a handle on that. And one of the challenges is the people who talk about complexity tend to do it in a way which nobody else understands. You have these very complicated systems modeling and so on. So how to get difficult, challenging concepts like complexity and put them in an operational form where you can actually use it without losing the fact that complexity is complex. Just to say a rather silly thing. So I think that's a very big area. Then another one is the whole area of gender. This is an area where the tools and techniques are very well developed for how to do evaluating women's empowerment. They're not used very much. It's very hard to think of any agency which is systematically addressing gender in a very broad way in its programs. You have a special gender program where you apply these tools, but for example, people who are evaluating road construction, water supply, power systems, tend not to focus on gender. It's not mainstreamed. It's not integrated in any systematic way. So I think that's again one of the cutting edge, one of the very big challenges. And then just the final one, and see a lot of these cutting edges are sort of challenges rather than where we've got to, is the issue of the missing, invisible, vulnerable groups. Many evaluations, many programs which are trying to look at how well they incorporate vulnerable groups miss huge numbers of people who just don't get covered by their sampling frames. For example, I was working in Colombia on the internally displaced population, the IDPs, and many supposedly rigorous evaluations have been done using the National Directory of IDPs, using randomized controlled trials and very sophisticated methods. Nobody had taken the trouble to realize that about 40% of the IDPs are not on the register. they're scared. Somebody's run away from a husband, you don't want to be found, there's some land disputes, you're from the wrong political party, you just don't trust the government, you don't want to be on a list. So people do these supposedly very rigorous evaluations and don't go to the trouble to find out that almost half of the population you're looking at is not on this list. And almost any sampling frame you find, there's many people who are illegal squatters. When you come to do a survey, they literally hide. Nobody knows they're in the community. The social security misses out a lot of people. The people who are registered to get health services, they're just not there. So a lot of studies are done on the people who use the services, but very little attention to how many people are just invisible, who are missing. And so I think that's a challenge that's related obviously to empowerment and giving voice to the poor. But if you don't even know that the poor are there, it's very hard to give them voice. So that's not something which gets a great deal of concern. It's difficult, it's expensive to actually go out and check on the ground how adequate your sample frame is, but I think it's an area of concern. I was advising on some evaluations in Somalia for some of the UN agencies, where it was too difficult for the evaluators to even go to the country. So they were having to use things like phone networks, where there's some Somali volunteers living in California who established contact with the phone network back in Mogadishu or wherever it is, and they were used for getting the information. Now that's obviously an extreme situation, but there's quite a few cases where it is just very dangerous to go to the country. So that's by no means an ideal situation, but phones have a lot of potential for doing interviews in urban areas where there's some areas of the slums are controlled by gangs, and when you talk about security, it's not just security for the outside interviewer. If you're the local guide, you're more at risk than the outside interviewer often, because you're considered as a traitor, you're an informer for the police or whatever. So a lot of people are concerned about their safety, but forget sometimes the risks that you're putting your local partners to, including again on gender. A lot of people, there's a lot of cultures where outsiders are not welcome to go and talk to women. And so sometimes you devise a strategy whereby the two interviewers will divide up, and one will be talking to the community leaders and the other one will sneak off to go and interview the women. And often not recognizing that you're maybe putting these women at risk. So being concerned about the safety of the people that you're talking to is an issue. There's trying to develop sort of confidence in the community and getting key informants. Sometimes you can get people who will collect a lot of the information for you. Like for example, if you're studying youth, you maybe get some people who can write diaries for you or get information. Always being very concerned about these issues of safety, but sometimes you can get some issues like that. One of the big challenges, which is related indirectly to that, is an ethical issue which comes up where I've talked to a lot of evaluators who are working, for example, in refugee camps, where a lot of the funding comes from a donor agency, and often the issue comes up that there's a lot of bad things happen to women in refugee camps, and it's a big dilemma for the evaluator. Do you put this in your report? There's a lot of NGOs who are very aware of these issues, and they very much welcome that you include that in your report to them. It's not that they're trying to hide it, but their concern is that, for example, if this report goes to the Congress in some countries, congressmen will stand up and say, our government is not going to give money to an organization which allows women to be raped. So this is a real ethical issue for you as an evaluator. You're not trying to hide what happens, but if you know that the report is going to be going to some donor agencies who have no understanding of these issues, and where somebody wants to get on the local television saying, you know, I'm a defender of women, I'm not allowed, you know, dollars from our country going to programs which are allowing these things to happen. So you get into these kinds of very complicated ethical issues where the agency is in no way trying to deny it. You know, this is their main work, is trying to prevent this, but they understand the dynamics of some of their funding agencies, how they will respond to that. So you get into a whole different world when you get into these extreme situations. And personally, for me, one of the things I've always found most difficult to handle, for example, I was working in Angola during the Civil War, and you go to the UN security briefing, and they draw you a map. This area you can go to if you're careful, you have to be back by curfew. This area you mustn't go into at all. And your local counterparts, they go into these areas, they do their work, they do the studies, but you can't go. And one's, you know, tempted sometimes to go, but you realize that would just be really stupid. You'd be putting your local counterparts at much more risk if they've got to worry about protecting you. But that's one of the most difficult things I found, where the people you're working with, they're putting themselves at a level of risk which you're not able to in that context, and you just feel really bad every evening. And they drop you back to wherever you're staying at curfew time, and then off they go to, you know, to do the work. And so it's, you know, it's not a place where, you know, being a hero is going to help anybody, but it's, you know, you really feel very, very bad about that. And the other just final thing on that in Angola, just working with people, you go all day, you never ever stop for food, and then you realize that your local partners, they have some food, but they're saving it to give to their family. So, you know, they just don't eat all day, and you don't eat all day if you're with them, and, you know, and that's quite a sort of, you know, you just think, you know, it's 3 in the afternoon now, when are we going to stop and get something to eat? And it's 6 in the evening, you still haven't stopped to eat. So you just sort of realize that the level of sort of sacrifice, of challenge of the local partners that you're working with, and just incredibly courageous people that you meet. But it's a real sort of sobering thought to, you know, to be in those areas and situations. And one of the sort of basic things you try to do is to use triangulation. You never ever just rely on one source of data. You know, if somebody says something, then you wonder. For example, if a woman says, you know, it's fine to walk around the streets at night, you think, well, you know, it's a bit of a surprise to me, because a lot of other people seem very nervous at going out at night. Then, you know, you try and check with other people, and you say, oh yes, she's the wife of the political leader, you know, it's her job to give a good impression to outsiders. So, but also, one is a challenge in other cultures, just things like body language, which you just don't understand if you're from a different culture very often. So somebody is saying something, but that you should be able to tell from their body that they, you know, when they say it's safe, they don't actually mean that. So there's all of these sort of levels of understanding which you tend to completely miss. So having some local people as your guides or interpreters is very critical. But one of the things which you really have to be careful with, the person that you will often be assigned to work with you, who maybe comes from the community, and, you know, acts as your interpreter, very often that's a person who's very strongly disliked in the community because they've left and they're now, you know, doing very well working with, you know, the foreigners. And often I've been in cultures where I speak the local language, and, you know, whether it's Spanish or Portuguese, and the person I was with didn't realize that, And so the person who's supposed to be just your guide is often saying really bad things to the local people. Don't say that to this important person, or don't waste the time with these things. Or sometimes they'll say to you, these people here, they're really very lazy. They don't work hard. I studied very hard, and I'm sort of better than you. So that's always a sort of challenge. And just finally, very quickly, one of the most extreme examples I discovered of that, I was working on some human trafficking programs in Southeast Asia, and we went to the court in Bangkok, where they had young girls from Cambodia who'd been arrested in a brothel, and were they guilty of a crime or whatever. And there was a Cambodian interpreter who was helping the girls, and one of our team happened to speak Cambodian, and he said, "Do you realize what this interpreter is?" He was lecturing these girls, saying, "You're a disgrace to your country, you're bringing dishonor on people like me who's worked so hard to have a decent life." And he's supposed to be there helping them, these poor 15-year-old girls, with the judge, and he's just trying to show he's so much better than they are. And so you just realize, unless you well prepared and you have people who can help you, you can just be completely lost in many cultural contexts, and you don't realize. You rely very much on the interpreter, and so when you say this was, whether what people were telling you is it sort of true or not, you really need to understand, who is this person? Are they from a local political party? Is it somebody who wants to say they're better than other people? And just so triangulating, getting these sort of different ways of different interpretations of what's happening is a real challenge. And when you're doing one of these very rapid evaluations, you're roaring around the community for a couple of hours in a jeep. It's really difficult for you to get the sort of handle on what is actually happening, who you're talking to, who you're not talking to, and so it's sort of quite sobering to realize how you can just come up with a completely wrong understanding of what has happened in a project. And so, if I could, just one final example of that, and you can edit out. I was working in Nicaragua, and the evaluators had been evaluating a project for helping women to promote market gardening, and we had a meeting with about 40-50 families, and the men were there as well, saying how great it was that their wife was earning more money and they helped with the housework. Everything seemed to be great, and I was feeling very uncomfortable. We don't seem to be meeting any people who are not part of the project, so we wondered what we could do. So we got to talk to the district nurse, and she drew us a map of every house in the community, and she said, this Senora Blanca, she's at the meeting, she's doing very well. Senora Rosa lives next door, her husband said she couldn't go to the meeting. The Senora Flor lives next door, she's unconscious in hospital because she went to the meeting without her husband's permission. He was so annoyed for her disobeying him, he just beat her unconscious. The police had to come to escort the ambulance to take her to hospital. And this was a community where the evaluation report had said, everybody really likes this project. And they had all of these testimonials from people who weren't lying. The people who were in the project, they were really doing very well. But they didn't go to the trouble to find out who's not in the meeting. And just, that was very dramatic. But it very often happens. There's always somebody who's excluded, and you don't know about it when you just come zooming in, and it's always the people who are hanging around outside the meeting room you'd really like to talk to, and often you can't if you don't speak the local language, or your interpreter says, no, he couldn't tell you anything, and pushes you out of the thing. So a lot of things to keep in mind.